The paradox of oneness, one integrated system, yet diversity is what keeps the system living. We will not know peace until we celebrate the differences. No hierarchy in God's kingdom, neither no supremacists. All people, all equal, so basic, so simple. One day the world will wake and we will all surrender. Give up the guns for the power of love. No, we're never giving up till we see the rising sun and move as one. Reparations for the past hurt won. Decolonization of the whole world, one. Healing up the generations, walk as one. One love, many nations move as one.
Good evening, relatives. This is Nick. The song you just heard was a song entitled One, featuring Lila June, Kwajo Spiri, and Eric Rabaska. Feel free to check it out. They have a YouTube channel. Really cool song, really cool album. If you get a chance to check it out. They gave me permission to use that song, so I think it's going to be the new theme music for our show. Thankful for them allowing me to use their music. So last episode we left off talking about the Daniel scroll, right? And how Creator will put an end to all self-exalting empires that exist at the detriment of any other part of creation. So we'll talk specifically about how this applies to the United States. That is to say, not only how the United States became an empire, but from the inception of satellite-based violence and manipulation to secure their goals. So how the United States used violence and manipulation to secure what they wanted. And the main goal, as we'll show, has always been to get the land. Land ownership and acquiring land has always been the objective. And since the original peoples lived with the land, the human people and at times the non-human people that were already here were deemed heathen, wild, and savage in order to justify the theft of their lands. So to talk about United States history apart from this history, this truthful accounting of the history, is to have a nation or to believe in the nationhood of a nation that doesn't really exist. Now I want to say from the inception of this episode that we're going to be doing a lot of truth-telling, but I want to do truth-telling with the mindset and with the heart of love and compassion. And while a lot of these topics can be very hard to talk about and very hard to wrap your mind around, especially if you come from a more conservative lens, it's really important that we do truth-telling because it's a revolutionary process. And while truth-telling in and of itself is not concerned with feelings, that is up to the person, it is concerned with the truth. And the truth must be dealt with so that our feelings and actions can stem from that place of authenticity. And the Euro-American population as a whole really has not done a lot of work in processing the real reality of what has happened on this continent, and specifically within North America and the United States. Because of this, I feel it is important to be discussed in this episode so we can really talk about and seek understanding and open-mindedness, which will in turn create further conversation and healing. So last episode we touched a little bit on the Papal Bull of 1493. And this Papal Bull basically gave Spain and Portugal the right to colonize, enslave, and convert anyone they found. This same Papal Bull would later be used by other Western nations to justify not only their subjugation of the indigenous peoples, but also enslavement of African descent peoples as well. Now, the United States used the Papal Bull very specifically in cases like Johnson and versus McIntosh and Sherrill versus Oneida, just to name a couple. And in Johnson versus McIntosh, this was a ruling that was done by John Marshall. And it was one of 3 cases which set the foundation for indigenous peoples removal. So this case basically deemed that indigenous human nations only had the right of occupancy in the same way that a tenant has the right to an apartment. AKA, the land is not their absolute right. The land can therefore, by their justification, be owned and occupied by somebody else and legally righted to somebody else because natives just have the right of quote-unquote occupancy. So this was one of 3 cases, like I stated before, which set the foundation for the removal of indigenous nations. Because if they don't have absolute right over their land, then somebody else can. And therefore, if they're pushed off, just like a tenant is evicted, then somebody can legally own the land and have absolute right to it. Now the other court case, and this is actually a very modern court case, relatively modern compared to the one which is Johnson versus McIntosh, which was in the early to mid 1800s. This was called Sherrill versus Oneida Nation, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a very prominent liberal justice who just passed away recently, voiced the majority opinion on this case. And this court decision was in 2005, and in this decision, the Oneida Nation tried to reacquire ancestral lands that had been bought by the state of New York in the early 1800s, but which violated the terms of their own federal law. And this law happened to be called the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. And as a sovereign nation, the Oneida Nation sought to reacquire some of their original territory that was seized. Now, how did the court answer to their claim? They said the embers of Oneida sovereignty have long ago grown cold, and therefore the United States, New York, and the town of Sherrill have proper sovereignty over said ancestral lands. Pretty revealing, right? And according to Ginsburg, and I'm going to quote from her here in a second, according to Ginsburg, the primary reason for this, for Oneida Nation, specifically sovereignty, growing cold, and United States, New York, and the town of Sherrill having proper sovereignty instead of the Oneida, and she just puts it plainly, under the doctrine of discovery, I'm quoting here, fee title to the lands occupied by Indians when colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign, which is to mean the king and queen of said European nation. First by the discovering European nation, and later the original states, and then the United States, end quote. So notice that she used the doctrine of discovery to justify why natives don't have a right to their land, and why the sovereign of the said European nation had the right to the land based off of that. By the way, Johnson versus McIntosh used the same doctrine of discovery argument to justify their ruling and the basis of their ruling. Now, a lot of natives are very familiar with the Papal Bull of 1493, especially decolonizing natives, but a lot of people are not aware of another Papal Bull, and this was the Papal Bull of 1452. Or maybe it's 1454, I forget the exact year. It was a long time ago, that's the point, right? Anyways, it was quite a few years before the one of 1493, and you can actually look it up. I believe it's called Romanus Pontifex. That's the name of the Papal Bull. In this Papal Bull, Pope Nicholas V gave permission to Alfonso of Portugal to conquer Saracens and pagans, putting that in quote marks there, in what is now Africa, and to enslave them into perpetual servitude. Now, this was the precursor to the Papal Bull of 1493, which gave dominion and authority to Europeans to conquer the Western Hemisphere. So you can see the language in that is very specific, to conquer the Saracens and the pagans, and then to actually enslave them. This is quoting the Latin here, to enslave them into perpetual servitude. So basically to subjugate and conquer them. Now, these laws and Papal Bulls, unsurprisingly, were fully actualized in the Western Hemisphere. So let's start with Jamestown. A lot of people are very familiar with Jamestown. This is one of the early settlements in the Americas, in the Turtle Island, and this town was established in 1607. I've actually been to the site of this place, and contrary to movies like Disney's Pocahontas, which has heavily influenced people's imagination or their thinking of what happened, it actually wasn't a very pretty picture. First of all, a lot of the colonists were starving, and they barely survived if it hadn't been for the rescuing efforts of the indigenous nations around them, namely the Powhatan Confederacy. But in 1609, 2 years after Jamestown was established and allowed to exist by the Powhatan, John Smith, who is usually made the hero and looked to be like the antithesis to the colonizers in the Disney movie, he actually threatened the people with violence and death if food and supplies were not given to the suffering English colonists. And Wohon Sanakok Powhatan, usually, hopefully I got his name right. I don't speak that indigenous language, but to anyone who may be a descendant, they can correct me. But Powhatan replied, "Why should you take by force that from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? What is the cause of your jealousy? You see us unarmed and willing to supply your wants, if you will but come in a friendly manner, and not with swords and guns, as to invade an enemy." That was a direct quotation from him responding to John Smith's threats of violence. And John Smith would actually later carry out his threats, killing many women and men and children as a result. This would also lead to the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, which led to the decimation of the Powhatan and surrounding nations. So we can see that the total objective was always to, especially as more people came, was to get more and more land. This is far from the typical Disney movie that you see with the Westerners actually living peaceably, except for when the governor intrudes. Next is the English settlement in Plymouth. And this is a really important one because Plymouth was kind of like the place, especially within the American imagination, where the American state formal started and had its origins with the Puritans. So we're going to discuss that a little bit and kind of deconstruct that. So this settlement of Plymouth was established by the Puritans in 1620. And it increased settlement and tensions between the natives as a result of that village expanding. Now, the Pequot in specific resisted and ended up killing 9 settlers and capturing 2 young women who were later returned to the English. What was the English's response? They engaged in a full-scale war against the Pequot, which would be dubbed the Pequot Wars of 1636 through 1638. And this culminated in the village of Mystic being burned, and 300 to 400 women, men, and children being burned alive. John Mason, the Connecticut militia leader who had largely led the attack, would later go on to say, "Thus," I'm quoting here, "thus the Lord was pleased to smite our enemies in the hinder parts, and to give us their land for an inheritance." End quote there. So we can see in his rhetoric there that the Lord was pleased to smite our enemies, which is chosen people kind of language, and to give us their land for an inheritance, promised land kind of language, which goes along with that chosen people narrative. Now this would later be followed by the Treaty of Hartford, in which the Pequot language and name were outlawed, their lands were taken forcibly, and the remaining survivors were sold into slavery far from their lands in the West Indies, or simply given as gifts of war to other Euro-Americans. Now we usually don't hear about this. We usually hear about the Thanksgiving, and they existed peaceably, and then the United States just gradually grew on its own, and maybe a little warfare here, but we never hear about. We hear about the genocide of natives going more in the plains and the westward expansion, but we never hear about the genocide that started right at the inception of the colonial project. And that story is really important to hear and to be told. And this set the tone for the English and later United States policy towards native peoples. This can be perfectly demonstrated through massacres that happened, like the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, in which the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples were told by the United States that they could safely reside on these lands that were accorded to them by the 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise, which was just a tiny sliver of land compared to their ancestral homelands and territories. But they accepted for the sake of peace. Colorado Territory Governor Evans enlisted Colonel John Shivington and his band of men to go out and get rid of them. And while they were marching on the camp, there was another couple commanders. Silas Soule was one of those commanders, and another officer who both refused to attack the people in the camp, the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples in that camp. And both are still well respected and honored by the Cheyenne and Arapaho people today, with many of them going to their graves and honoring them with songs and flowers, things like that. Now Shivington and those who followed his command proceeded to murder, rape, and mutilate around 150 people, mostly women and children. So clearly this was a largely defenseless camp. This wasn't, they didn't have a lot of men in it to defend, the women and children and the elders. It was largely, not that women are defenseless or not warriors, but it was largely, they knew what they were doing. They knew that this was a defenseless camp. They even had a white flag over it, peace flag, with the United States flag. And Shivington, who also just happened to be a Methodist minister, is said to have stated, quoting here, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians." And that's just one of many, many stories recorded by Native peoples, not just in the North, but all across the hemisphere, about treaties, not only treaties being broken, but also genocide and massacres happening along with it. And then we could talk about the military interventions in the South, which usually don't get brought up into this conversation, but I believe it's related. And it's related because I have a personal story about this. Part of my family comes from what is now called Guatemala, in Cachiquamaya and Mam territory, as I introduced myself in the initial episode. And in Guatemala, there was a president who was elected back in, I believe it was I don't remember the exact year, I think it was 1945. It was in the 1940s sometime. And at this time, there was a company in Guatemala known as United Fruit, which is now known as Chiquita. But United Fruit had a lot of land holdings in what is now Guatemala. And as a U.S. company, not only did they have a lot of land holdings, but they had a lot of influence in the country. They had a lot of control over the government and over the leadership that was and the powers that were. And the new president that came in, he basically wanted to do land reforms. He wanted to give back a lot of the lands that were worked by mostly indigenous peoples back to them and to the poor people of that area. Well, United Fruit, of course, saw this as a direct threat to them and their livelihoods. So they phoned up the United States government, I believe, got in touch with the head of state or someone high up in the office. The details are eluding me. You can research this, though. They got in touch with them, and they basically sent a military flight and ousted the first democratically elected government of that nation. This created a 36-year civil war in Guatemala, where 200,000 Maya peoples were killed over the duration of this war. And almost all of them were not engaged in warfare at all. They were massacred. And the United States knew about this, and they were the ones who actually trained the Guatemalan military to do the things they were doing, whether it was counterinsurgency, and they knew that innocent people, they knew that Maya were being targeted. And worse yet, they claimed them to be communists, just like they did with the AIM, with the American Indian movement in the North. They claimed they were communists to dismiss them and gain the popular imagination against them. So they knew very much what they were doing. And there are accounts of children being thrown down wells and gasoline being poured on them and lit on fire. There's accounts of women being raped and then killed. There are stories that are so atrocious that they're comparable to the initial Spanish colonization of these lands and all the atrocities that came with them. And some of them are even worse than what the Spaniards committed initially. So that's just Guatemala, and part of my family had to leave from there because of that history. This isn't only the modern nation state of Guatemala. The indigenous peoples were especially targeted in the modern day nation states of Honduras, Nicaragua, Brazil, many more, in which the United States intervened in those nations, and which the history of those nations largely targeted indigenous peoples, in which many native innocent people were targeted and killed. And this led to mass migrations and fleeing of large amounts of native or indigenous descent peoples north due to this violence, and which is still, of course, coming up into this day. So that is part of the conversation as well. And of course, not only was there the genocide that the papal bulls actualized, which were set in place by the state church, but forced displacement. You have the Trail of Tears, the Longest Walk, and the removal of many other nations to Indian territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma. And then you also have the enslavement of African descent relatives who are forcibly removed and put through horrible trauma to make money for their Western slave masters. It really should not be lost to us as well, and it should be part of this conversation, that the reason that many African Americans have Western last names especially is because their African language, their names, African languages I should say, their names, their lands, and their identity were forcibly removed from them. And then that leads us into assimilation. And with natives particularly, this manifested into the area of boarding schools. These schools had the motto of "Kill the Indian, save the man." A man by the name of Richard Pratt was the chief architect of these schools. And in these schools, our languages were forbidden, our names were forbidden, our clothing was forbidden, our long hair and our spirituality and traditional values, they were forbidden, and they were to be replaced, hence "Kill the Indian, save the man," with the forced acceptance of Western names, Western language, specifically English, clothing, hairstyles, religion, and Western values. This led to the Code of Indian Offenses of 1883. This was a law that was set in place by the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which restricted the religious and cultural ceremonies of First Nations. And the irony is that the Constitution is supposed to grant the freedom of religion, right? But here was a law set in place by the United States which actually restricted religious and spirituality among First Nations peoples. And this freedom of religion for indigenous nations was not codified into law until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. Then you had, as part of assimilation, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which in turn destroyed traditional and ethical values and kinship systems, and put in their place a hierarchy of power based off of a presidency and Western systems of power, which contradicted indigenous value systems of servant leadership. And not only did you have the forced assimilation of indigenous descent peoples to these lands, but you also had the forced assimilation of non-Anglo-Saxon descent European populations, like the Irish and the Italians, and their changing of non-English names to anglicize them to make them more acceptable within the English language. You also had to fit within you had to pledge your allegiance to the United States, right? Hence the Pledge of Allegiance. You're pledging your allegiance to this new state, willing to fight in their wars. We'll get to that a little bit later. You also, even those who were accepted, there was still a sense of non-acceptance and hostility towards outsiders, especially previously Anglo-Saxon colonized nations like the Irish, who had recently been colonized by the English, and who had bitterly resisted in their history, but also later included the Japanese and Chinese, especially with internment camps and the forced labor of Chinese in the West. So how did the United States project justify themselves? Well, one of their primary modes of justification all the way up until the present day is to say that this land was sparsely populated, right? Because if there's few people here, well, the settlers didn't really hurt that many people. We were destined to be here, right? Like, it's like we didn't really hurt that many. There weren't many of you here anyways, so we shouldn't feel too bad about being here. The problem is there's a lot of settler accounts of quote unquote fires as far as the eye can see. In other words, like fires that were communal fires that the people had in their villages, and you couldn't see anything but fires. There was accounts of that, and just land teeming with people. But these accounts were usually dismissed or ignored, of course, in order to justify the common narrative being told, which gave a right to colonize. And there's a man by the name of William M. Denevan, a researcher and professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he, along with a team of researchers, came to the conclusion that the discovery, and I'm quoting here, the discovery of America, quote unquote, was followed by possibly the greatest demographic disaster in the history of the world. Research by some scholars provides population estimates of the pre-contact Americas to be as high as 112 million in 1492, while others estimate the population to have been as low as 8 million. In any case, the native population declined to less than 6 million by 1650. That's a crazy amount to think of when considering how much the population has decreased. in that amount of time. Now, the conservative estimate, based on recent scholarship, archaeological findings, and early accounts by explorers, is estimated at around 54 million people in the period around 1492. So, by comparison, the population of Europe as far east as the Ural Mountain Range was around 50 million for the whole of Europe. So you had 50 million people around 1482 in Europe, and you had 54 million people in the whole Western Hemisphere. And that just goes to show that this continent, or even just the northern section of this continent, was very far from sparsely populated. It was teeming with people, which completely dismisses the sparsely populated hemisphere idea. And then there was another justification that was commonly used, and that was the idea of civilized or uncivilized. Now, in order to understand this, we first have to define, based off of what the Westerners thought civilized was, and indeed what we think of civilized as. So, the Anglo definition of civilized had to do with refinement and status, and this was largely disconnected from the earth. This meant like enormous cities, large towns, how big you could build things was looked at as a definition of whether you were civilized or not, and your separation from the dirtiness of the earth. Your material success, which was largely defined by Enlightenment values of material progress and institutional learning. Also, a symbol of being civilized was fancy clothes, Western fancy clothes I should add, Western values and manners. They were all defining characteristics of what Westerners thought of as quote-unquote civilized. Now, here on Turtle Island, we had a different definition. We didn't have the word civilized, of course, but when we thought of what it was to be civilized, or what it was to be a human being, what it was to be that, our code of ethic was defined by being a good relative. And how great you are was defined by how well you take care of your people, how much you give. And this value system was very much connected to the earth. And contrary to modern science and anthropology and archaeology is now just finding this out, along with help working with native people, they're finding these things out, that we actually had very advanced systems of natural health care. We had plant medicine knowledge. There's even accounts of surgery and very well orchestrated surgery, I should add. Astronomy, democratic and leadership systems, the sciences, and biomimicking agricultural practices. In other words, agriculture that mimicked the natural world and used the natural world to create more abundance, to name just a few areas. And because these were not deemed important to Westerners, they were looked at as savage and backwards. And while Western dualistic thinking was centered on human abundance at the sake or at the expense of the rest of creation, indigenous peoples understood and learned that human abundance goes hand in hand with the earth's abundance and health. Now, a lot of scholars reason that these lands were able to support such a huge group of people because we had systems in place which provided abundance for all creatures, not just human. And our definition of what it meant to be a good relative, aka I would redefine civilized as being a good relative, is defined by an ethic of responsibility versus the Western ideal of an ethic of rights. So that was the civilized or uncivilized argument. And this led to terms like heathen, savage, and all these different ones to describe the brutality and the wildness of the continent and the peoples that inhabited the continent. And really what it is just a clash of value systems. And the same clash is still apparent to this day. Which leads to the third justification. And the third justification had to do with theology. It had to do with the mindset, not only the dualism that the Westerners had, which was rooted in Plato, which is a Greek philosopher, but it also had to do with the theological understandings of the Puritans and English settlers. And they thought it as their mission to enlighten and civilize the world. And many of these early settlers, and especially the Puritans, were strict Calvinists. Many of them believed in the idea that there were those who were predestined to be chosen, saved, and go to heaven in their theological framework, and those that are not chosen, opposed to them, and therefore go to hell, quote unquote. This idea suggested that God destined some he chose to be shown mercy, and those who are not chosen to have mercy withheld. This view would also impact the growth and thinking of the later United States. And we're going to quote an article here. I think it really sums it up pretty good. It's a little bit long, but I think it'll be helpful. It's a writer named Ginger Harwood of Spectrum magazine, and it's entitled America and the Two-Horned Beast, Revelation 13. And I'm beginning my quote here, quoting her now. In 1630, the Puritans left England with a charter for a new colony in Massachusetts, their new home in a new world where they could structure society in accordance to their view of God's revealed plan for social conduct and religious worship. Before they left their ship, the Arbella, future Governor John Winthrop articulated to the assembled passengers a vision for their project in the New World. Borrowing Christ's phrase from the parable of salt and light in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Winthrop declared, "We will be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us," affirming their commitment to model righteous living. Their colony would be a beacon of light, a model of Christian charity, guiding the rest of Europe into progress towards true religion as outlined by reformer John Calvin. When Winthrop asserted that the divine hand of providence had predestined a unique role for their enterprise, one that eventually would be projected onto the American endeavor as a whole, he laid the foundations for what has been called American exceptionalism. In this view, America is different and even morally superior to other nations. America's Christian or Protestant beginnings, reflected in its national rhetoric and values, its God-given mandate to transform the world, and the establishment of a republic as a system of government, all helped colonists to perceive their quality as superior to that of the corrupt European countries and the barbaric heathen nations of the world. As time passed, the American Revolution and the Constitution were often added as evidence to its uniqueness and moral superiority over other nations, as they inaugurated a system designed to protect liberty, egalitarianism, democracy, and capitalism. Further, Americans prided themselves on religious freedom, instituted during a period when other nations were characterized by state religions that forced individuals to acknowledge, attend, and support the official church regardless of personal consciences and convictions. Further, certain groups of Christians believed that these characteristics opened the door for American Christians to facilitate the return of Jesus Christ. Indeed, this belief in the special role of America in God's plan for the world, and God's support and endorsement for her activities, which was evidenced by her victories in increasing size and power, evolved into an expectation that Americans would have an unquestioned allegiance to the theory of America's manifest destiny, to rule the continent and intervene in or regulate the affairs of the world. Ministers' sermons promoted patriotism and used biblical imagery to inspire their parishioners to participate in military campaigns against peoples or nations they depicted as evil or pagan, needing to be brought under the control of God and the virtuous government of the United States. Nationalism acquired the cloak of religious sanction, as God's will and national power were perceived as two sides of the same coin. National political and economic interest shaped Christian corporate ethics, instead of the teachings of Christ being the standard by which the nation's activities were judged. The belief that God had placed leaders in the positions they occupied and guided their actions, as well as the supposition that he championed American supremacy, created a Christian duty to support the state, uphold its laws, and participate in its wars. In short, the belief in America's special place in history, its moral virtue and superiority, its destiny to be the world leader and arbiter, and the generalized notion that America was the new Israel, the center of God's interest and blessing, led many Christians to support the economic and political endeavors of the nation without question. End quote. Man, that's a long quote, but I hope you can really grasp it. If you didn't grasp it all, re-listen to it over and over and over again until you get it. Because if you don't get it, the history of the United States is made very hard to follow. That's like the history of the United States in a nutshell, in that single quote. But you can see in the end of that quote, when I was quoting it, was the idea that America was the new Israel. And if you remember the history of Israel, one of the key highlights in the story was when the descendants of Abraham and Israel, or Jacob, they live in Egypt, and there's a new pharaoh that comes in play, and basically this pharaoh doesn't remember the promises that were given to Joseph, and he starts enslaving them and oppressing them. And Yahweh looks down and remembers his covenant with the people, his agreement. Comes to Moses, and the people are freed and vindicated from the oppressive Egyptian empire and the Egyptian oppressed. And this is actually playing off of earlier accounts where God is purposely acting contrary to the empires that are trying to usurp his rule. So these early settlers, they co-opted the very much Hebrew narrative about their escape from Egypt, which in their case they co-opted and made about their escape from Europe, into a land of promise, which they equated with the Western Hemisphere, specifically the northern part of the Western Hemisphere. So they made a story about their escape from Europe into a land of promise. But the two key differences about this story are that, one, this land they didn't originally have a relationship with, because Abraham and his offspring originally lived in that land, and they were just returning back to it when they were freed. The second part, that is a huge key and that is a huge difference, is that they were the Egyptians in the story, not the Hebrews. They were the ones oppressing, not the ones being freed from oppression. Notice the quote, we mentioned it earlier in regards to John Mason. Thus the Lord was pleased to smite our enemies in the hinder parts and to give us their land for an inheritance. He's trying to resurrect this idea, which was very prominent at the time, that God was clearing the way for them. And the crazy thing is, the additional irony is that both the Hebrews, the Narragansetts, the Pequots, the Wampanoag, the Powhatan, and the rest of our indigenous nations native to this continent were all brown. Like, how do you get that narrative unless you think that the Hebrews were somehow European, right? And of course, that's a whole other topic, which we can get into another time. But then there's the centrality of land. And we kind of talked about this initially, but the land that would become the eastern United States and the Northeast specifically at that time were looked at as destined by God to be given by them. We talked about that a little bit. But it's always been about the land. And Plymouth itself was established as a perfect example of this, on top of an abandoned Patuxet village, which was ravaged by Western diseases. And this was looked at by the Puritan settlers as God clearing the way, which was heavily reinforced by their Calvinist thinking of God orchestrating everything that happens, whether good or bad, and saying that anything that happens is according to his desire or will. Now, it should not be forgotten to us, getting ready to close here, that all of this was done in the name of God. And it's still very much in the popular imagination. They used God to justify their pursuits. And the use of God to justify the colonization of these lands has largely taken root in the national narrative. A perfect example of that is the song, "This Land is My Land." This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. Other examples of different songs that are still common in the popular narrative are "God Bless America," "The Star-Spangled Banner," and others. A line of the Star-Spangled Banner even goes like this: "Then conquer we must, for our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust." And conquer we must, for our cause it is just. How do you decide whether our cause is just or not? Well, because the closing line says, "Our God is our trust." If God is the one for us, then conquer we must. It's part of our identity, and it has to be just because of that. And if you don't agree with that, who are you to disagree? That's the common narrative. Now, at this point, I want to clarify that not every Euro-American is or was complicit in the harms done. There were actually many who did and still do stand against the oppression of the colonial powers that be and the empire. And a good example of this that I've seen firsthand was at Standing Rock in 2016, where a lot of Euro-American allies came and supported our indigenous nations, came there and helped fight to protect the water and to protect our lands. And that was awesome to see and awesome to be a part of. That being said, history has shown that Euro-American allies are largely the exception in this continent, not the rule. And it should also be stated that the U.S. has many good principles. This is kind of what I'm going to close with. Many good principles, many of which, admittedly, they learned from indigenous communities like the Haudenosaunee, which heavily influenced and contributed to the formation of the U.S. Constitution and the division of powers. And the U.S. Senate even attested to this in the Senate Resolution 331 in 1988. That being said, however, the U.S. fundamentally failed to live by those values and ideals. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, where is God in all of this? Did God actually orchestrate this? Did he want this to happen? Was the Creator orchestrating the colonization and genocide of our peoples through the Puritans? Maybe not. Yes? No? Well, we're going to answer this question and others in the next and last episode of this mini-series. Does Creator have anything to say against Christian empire? Stay tuned and stay well, relatives.